Ahead on Straight Talk, amid the push on Capitol Hill to reduce federal spending, one of the major programs on the chopping block, international aid.
Elon is doing a great job. He's finding tremendous fraud and corruption and waste.
The Trump administration pushing to cancel nearly 90% of contracts with the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Our goal was to go in and align our foreign aid to the national interest.
We sit down with two current and former international workers to discuss the impact of the administration's moves, including the end of programs at Portland-based Mercy Corps.
It's a devastating number of people that won't be served by these programs.
From fired federal workers.
I have a 15-month-old at home, and I'm looking at him and thinking, well, what's this country that we're now living in?
To what could happen in the absence of American assistance.
We have concerns about countries like China, Russia, moving in.
Right now on Straight Talk. Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Stephanie Domerat. Today we take a look at the changing landscape around U.S. foreign aid after recent drastic cuts in federal funding. Now those cuts impacting local international aid groups like Mercy Corps. Joining us to break down this complex topic are two Portlanders who have extensive experience with international aid. Niels Marquardt is a former U.S. ambassador nominated for several diplomatic positions by former President George W. Bush. In total, Marquardt spent 33 years serving in the State Department. Prior to joining the ranks of America's top diplomats, he spent 2 years as a volunteer with the Peace Corps teaching English in Rwanda. Also joining us today is Craig Redmond, the CEO of Relief International. It's an international aid organization. Redmond has spent 30 years in global humanitarian and development assistance. He also served as the Senior Vice President of Programs for Portland-based Mercy Corps for 14 years until 2022. Niels, Craig, thanks so much for being here today. I really appreciate it, guys.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Okay, first, I want to ask you, Craig, as we mentioned, you have worked in international aid for more than 30 years. So what do you love about this work? What keeps you going?
Oh, you know, I love the diversity of the work. The challenges that we face are so complex and so fascinating that it just keeps being challenging and interesting. And then at the end of the day, you get to save and improve lives around the world. So that is just an incredibly rewarding work to do.
Niels, you also have been doing this for a long time now, a volunteer at Lewis and Clark College as well. But you were nominated, as we mentioned, by President George W. Bush to be U.S. ambassador. So give us the big picture of what foreign U.S. humanitarian aid has looked like in the past.
Well, it's something we basically invented after World War II with the Marshall Plan, and then for a couple of decades after World War II, we did it in a sort of ad hoc way as needs arose around the world. And then I think under the Kennedy administration, when so many new countries emerged, particularly in Africa, USAID was created in 1961, the Peace Corps was founded in 1961, and it was kind of a whole new world that I grew up in, listening to the president and being very inspired by him, his inaugural address, and just the notion that Americans would go out and help others who are less fortunate than ourselves. And that was the basis of, I think, a pillar of American foreign policy for over 60 years.
Is that why you wanted to get into it?
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of living in the developing countries and representing the most powerful country on earth and using that power to improve lives and stabilize governments and create just a better world was something that I found both as a Peace Corps volunteer and later as a diplomat to be irresistible.
And how did, in your opinion, the world see the U.S. as far as its relations with helping on foreign aid?
Well, they saw us very positively. I remember, in the 70s, so, countries like Rwanda had been around for 15 years. They were teenagers. And being a volunteer there and realizing that people really respected our country because we had this altruistic streak, we had this philanthropic impulse, we wanted to help people like themselves. And it was really quite moving to be an agent of that kind of relationship and to go out and actually make that difference.
So in recent months, we know the Trump administration has canceled more than 80% of programs at USAID. In an executive order, he wrote that, quote, foreign aid industry and bureaucracy are not aligned with American interests and in many cases antithetical to American values. Niels, we spoke to you back in February when these cuts first happened. You said you were in shock at that time. How are you feeling about this now?
Well, the shock hasn't entirely gone away. I mean, there have been other agencies of the government that have been dismantled in the meantime. That was AID, and I would point out many of the things that are happening under this administration are the fulfillment of campaign promises. Okay, so we saw it coming. This came out of left field. No, there was no statement during the campaign that USAID should be eliminated or trimmed. It was a non-issue. So this came out almost in the first week, I think. If I was here in February, yeah, it was one of the first things out of the box. And then it's just been kind of a wrecking ball that's continued to swing. The Millennium Challenge account, which is another foreign aid program that most Americans have never heard of, but a very interesting one that was also created under President George W. Bush, lasted for 20 years under Republicans and Democrats, and now it's been shut down.
And what was the primary goal of that program?
Well, this was a program that rewarded countries that had really good governance structures, that fought corruption, that invested in their people, invested in health, and invested in education. If they didn't meet the criteria, which were really a very high bar, then they couldn't be considered. So not only did we reward countries that met the criteria, in Madagascar, where I served as ambassador, was the first country to get one of these compacts, but we also incentivized other countries to lift their game so that they could be considered. So it was a catalyst for fighting corruption, for improving lives, for investing in people around the world.
Craig, what was your reaction to these changes in February and since then? Yeah,
well, we knew that there would be some cuts. And we knew some things were going to happen, but the depth of the cuts and how dramatic they were made and the way that they were made kind of broadsided all of us in the sector. I think part of the deal for us is the challenge is the uncertainty of it. So the cuts were made on the 24th of January. We were told that the grants were going to be discontinued. And then there was a carve out so humanitarian programs could continue. And then those were discontinued again. And then they rescinded that order. So, at Relief International, we do primary health care work. So the uncertainty of that means that we can't plan around getting pharmaceuticals in, the pipeline of equipment, getting doctors and nurses where they need to be, means that it's really hard for us to do the kind of work that we need to do.
Niels, if you're looking back in history and context for what we're seeing now versus what we have seen, can you compare this amount of change to another time in recent history?
No, I can't. I think this is unprecedented, kind of an overused word in the last 5 years, but no, we've never had anything like this. And, when just listening to the words of our Secretary of State, where he talks about aligning the approach to foreign aid with the administration's values, I mean, that's a normal thing. And so an administration comes in, they look at programs, they change or eliminate the ones that they don't agree with, and life goes on. And from what I can tell, maybe I would say maximum 5% of what USAID was in any way controversial, mostly to do with reproductive health and gender identity. I never saw any programs like that in the countries where I was ambassador, but they did exist, and it would have been a simple thing to discontinue them and continue the good work of public health, education, protecting the environment around the world. Instead, they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater.
I want to talk locally what we're seeing here in Portland and in Oregon. Just last week, Mercy Corps, the Portland-based international group we mentioned, announced it has been crippled by federal funding cuts. The U.S. government had been its largest financial backer. For nearly 5 decades, Mercy Corps has delivered aid to people affected by conflict, natural disasters, other crises, for those who aren't familiar. But the recent cuts forced them to shut down about 40 of their roughly 60 U.S.-funded programs that included feeding malnourished children, providing sanitation to prevent disease, and finishing a clean water system specifically for 12,000 people in Afghanistan. It's brought the critical humanitarian work that they do to a halt. Take a listen.
So it's a devastating number of people that won't be served by these programs. We've calculated it something like 3.5 million people around the world in countries where we're working. And these aren't just any countries. These are countries that are being faced with extraordinary situations.
Craig, now you spent 25 years with Mercy Corps until just a few years ago. Can you talk about what could be those 40 programs and what kind of impact that could have?
Yeah, the impact of the closure of those programs is just dramatic. Not only, as you rightly said, are they life-saving, but also investing in people's skills, investing in economic development opportunities and things like that around the world. It's just devastating for organizations like Mercy Corps and for Relief International, where failure to continue to invest in those places, particularly the ones where we work, were the toughest ones. If you look at the Human Development Index, the toughest 10 countries in that index, Relief International works in 7 of those, and Mercy Corps does the same kind of work. Stopping to invest in those places destabilizes the world in a substantial way.
Which countries are those?
Well, I'm talking about places like Sudan and South Sudan. I'm talking about places like Afghanistan, places like Syria, places like Gaza, places like that are really, really in desperate need of support that we give.
And what kind of support is Mercy Corps, or was Mercy Corps when you were there, or Relief International, doing for those specific countries?
Mercy Corps at the time was focusing pretty heavily on economic development, a lot of work in economic development, and Relief International focuses mostly on primary health care. So that first stop, when somebody has a need or there's a baby that's going to be born, that first place you go, that clinic, that's where you go. And the absence of those clinics means that families are in real trouble. In a place like Yemen, we run a whole series of primary health care clinics across the country. We've had to close 15 of those clinics, 15, thousands of people. In Syria, it's the same story, and on and on and on.
And this is just in the last couple of months?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
What else have you seen with your organization right now?
Well, we've had to also, we're a team of about 7,000 people around the world. As a result of these cuts, we've trimmed our team down to about 5,000 in 3 months. That's dramatic. Mm-hmm. So our ability to do the work that we do has been dramatically hampered.
I want to talk about now a poll that was released in 2023. It was an AP NORC poll. It found that 7 out of 10 Americans, so most Americans, tended to believe that too much money was going to other countries. Too much money was going overseas. Now, we know Americans are struggling to buy groceries. They're dealing with inflation, how to pay rent. Niels, what would you say to those people who say our money should stay here domestically and address those needs first?
Well, I'd say a few things. First of all, what happens in these polls is that you realize that Americans have a vastly overstated understanding of how much money actually is spent on foreign assistance. I mean, it's less than 1% of the federal budget, right? It's about, AID was about $40 billion, and there were other programs on top of that. Sounds like a lot of money, but it's less than 1% of the budget. The impact that one gets from that, when you think of sort of the mix of, as an ambassador, you look sort of, what do you have in your toolkit? You've got soft power, you've got hard power. Hard power is the most expensive power. So bringing in the military to fix a problem, most expensive thing you can do. But working on economic development and improving, public health, those kinds of things over time really pay dividends, both in terms of how people feel about the United States and how they actually live. But I would say to the American people that, we are a generous people. Philanthropy is kind of built into our genetics. And I think most Americans, when they realize how little we actually spend, at that point they say, well, we should keep doing that. We shouldn't give nothing. We shouldn't give nothing. And once they have the facts, I think they come around to the view that this is actually a pretty good investment.
Mm.
Craig, what do you think?
I think that's really an interesting point that Niels makes. I remember that. I remember that survey, and people said, "Do you think too much is being spent?" And they say yes. And then the next question, how much do you think is being spent? And most people say 20-25% of the federal budget. Of course, as Niels rightly points out, less than 1%. So it's not this massive portion of what we do. I think I love what you said about the generosity of spirit of Americans. I think our values actually are that we believe we should do this because it's within our values, but also it makes perfect sense to do this in the age of pandemics, in the age of markets being global, resources being global. Of course we should engage in meaningful ways with every country on earth. Absolutely we should.
I just add one thing, which is, this false binary choice, whether we're going to help ourselves or we're going to help other people, we really can do both. We've shown that over decades, and there are political choices to be made about how we want to spend our money, of course, and that's what the administration should be working on.
When we talked to you a couple months ago, you had mentioned that the other concern with this is if the U.S. stops doing this work, that someone else could step in and do that work. Who would that be, and why is that a concern?
Well, actually, the more I've thought about it, the more I realized I was wrong. The greater concern is that nobody's going to step in, and that these, for example, the President's Emergency Fund for HIV and AIDS relief, PEPFAR, in Africa, where 25 million Africans are receiving regular medication.
Yeah.
Your team is probably involved in that, Craig.
Yeah.
So that has stopped virtually. I mean, it's hard to get a real beat on what exactly has happened out in the field, but tens of millions, several millions of people are not receiving those drugs, and that's a death sentence. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. Thank you both for being with us. We're going to continue our conversation right after this. Stay with us. And welcome back to Straight Talk. We are continuing our conversation with two Oregonians about the impacts we're seeing in U.S. foreign humanitarian aid coming from recent federal funding cuts. Each of our guests has spent 30 plus years in international aid. Niels and Craig, thank you again for being here today. I really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
I want to ask Niels a question for you in the second half. Some argue that foreign aid lacks transparency and opens the door to waste and corruption. What would you say to those people?
Well, that's certainly not my experience. I mean, I would say one thing about USAID is that there was so much oversight of every dime that was spent. I mean, if anything, I would say there was probably too many reports that had to be written to make sure that the taxpayer funds that were expended on aid were properly accounted for. So that has not been a problem, and the way we, in terms of fighting corruption, which is actually one of the objectives of USAID around the world, I think we had an exemplary process in place to make sure that funds from American taxpayers could not be diverted from the intended purpose.
Okay. Were you going to add to that?
I was going to add to
Yes.
that, just to say, as somebody who is currently administering grants from USAID, the systems in place to make sure that something doesn't go wrong are robust. That not only the financial, but the compliance and regulations around those, and the reporting that we do around that is really, really robust. So it's actually not accurate.
Okay.
Yeah. And the proof of it is that with all this nosing into what AID has been doing in its dismantlement, I have not seen any stories about waste or fraud. There haven't been any revealed.
Well, Trump's stated goal was to reduce spending as well, cut waste in federal spending, across the board, including USAID. When you were an ambassador, were there areas that you felt like could have been more efficient, or spending could have been cut, or money could have been used better?
There was always something on the margin that could be improved. And again, this sort of very heavy oversight of everything that was done in the country because of a concern about avoiding corruption and fraud and mismanagement. It was perhaps a little too much and kind of slowed down the whole process. But I certainly understood and never would have suggested as an ambassador that we do shortcuts to be more efficient in delivering this aid. It was simply part of the process.
So it just felt like red tape that was there that could have been removed, but you understood.
Well,
and
useful
respected
red
it.
tape,
Yes.
just to make absolutely certain that you could, it would have been a very devastating blow to foreign assistance if there had been stories, and I'm not aware of any, where the money was diverted, for corrupt purposes. I'm not aware of it ever happening.
So looking ahead at where we are now and what's to come, it sounds like there will be more organizations that will have impacts from these cuts. We will see more cuts coming. Where do you see U.S. aid now going? USAID as far as foreign programs kind of evolving?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it depends on what happens with State Department. State Department is going to take over some of those functions. Niels and I were talking before, our worry also is that we've lost so much expertise, so much USAID experience and depth of experience and expertise is lost. That's one thing. So the money is one thing, but the loss of expertise is a real worry. And how they rebuild that under State Department is a big question.
What do you think is next?
Well, it is moving to the State Department, but they basically dismantled the whole process, and they're going to have to rebuild it in an organization for which that's not been a primary mission. I think it's going to be very difficult to do it. 10,000 workers in AID doing programs around the world. How many are going to end up in the State Department? I mean, thinking right now, it's a very small number. They've got to build that up. I'm concerned.
What do you see for the humanitarian aid sector in general and people in this field? I mean, do they view this as a short-term setback that may just follow with this administration, or do they see this as long-term beyond the Trump administration?
The colleagues in other organizations I talk to see this as a fundamental restructuring. I don't think it's a short-term thing. I think it's a major restructuring that we have to manage and have to reimagine ourselves as a sector, how we do the work that we do. But politically, things change. They swing the other direction. There'll likely be a positive developments later. But I think it's a fundamental shift.
What do you think, Niels?
Well, I think so too. I mean, I think you could imagine in over the course of time, a different administration comes in and they realize that the changes that were made so abruptly and without much real consideration by this administration should be revisited. And I could see over time rebuilding that. But the expertise, as Craig says, of current people who have 20, 30 years of experience delivering both development assistance and humanitarian aid will have been lost. So we'll have to rebuild that up. In the meantime, I guess one positive glimmer is that you see people, I mean, today I read that Bill Gates is as far as I can tell, he's going to really up his contribution to particularly public health and see if he can fill a big part of that gap. So those are positive glimmers, but that's really not the way, in my view, that this should be happening in the United States.
And you mentioned the U.S. is a big player globally for humanitarian aid. Mm-hmm. With these changes we're seeing, does it change the diplomacy of the U.S. in foreign policy or how we stand on the global stage?
Well, I think this coupled with the way we're treating our allies and many other developments that are just, to me, unimaginable just 6 months ago, the impact of that is for friends and allies to call into question the reliability of the United States as a partner. And that was probably our most valuable currency. Everywhere I served as U.S. ambassador, whether I liked it or not, and I tried to be a modest kind of American overseas, but whether I liked it or not, people looked to the United States as, you're the leader of this. We invented foreign assistance. We're the most outspoken country on issues like good governance and fighting corruption. So naturally, that mantle of leadership was on our shoulders. I don't think that's the case anymore, and I don't think, because of what's happening in our country, I don't think we have the credibility that we once had. And this, I find a very sad thing.
That humanitarian leadership was a calling card of the U.S. government. When a disaster happened or something dramatic happened or a conflict happened, you could always count on USAID and the DART team to be there among the first. And the funding would come out among the first. And the loss of that is really dramatic. And while other donors have stepped up, just the size and influence that the U.S. has on those rapid onset emergencies just can't be overstated. What
can local people do to get involved or feel like they have their voices heard in this or are doing some sort of action?
Well, I'm probably, we agree on this, but reach out to your representative for sure and tell them you care about international aid and that it matters domestically and internationally. That it is, in fact, in keeping with our values. That's one thing. And if you feel like you want to give to Relief International, we would love that. But we understand that, if that's not the case, that's also okay.
We are out of time for the show, but thank you so much for being here, Niels. Craig, I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks a
you
lot,
very much.
Stephanie. Yeah.
And thank you so much for watching. Be sure to join us next week as we talk to Portland Police Chief Bob Day. And a reminder that you can stream Straight Talk on your own schedule anytime. You can download the free KHW Plus app, available now on Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV. We'll see you next week. Until then, be well.